Ethan Caldwell stood motionless at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, the pulse of New York City alive beneath him. The golden hues of the setting sun bounced off the iconic skyline, casting a warm glow over his meticulously curated empire. From the outside, Ethan's life was the epitome of success. He was the founder of Caldwell Innovations, a billion-dollar tech conglomerate, with his name synonymous with power and precision. Yet, as he stared down at the world he had conquered, a weight pressed against his chest, one that no amount of wealth or influence could ease. He held a guest list in his hand, an exclusive inventory of the elite attending his upcoming wedding to Victoria Lang, a dazzling socialite from one of Manhattan's most prominent families. The list, printed on embossed ivory paper, symbolized a life of achievement and prestige. But as Ethan's eyes scanned the names, one thought gnawed at him, persistent and unrelenting. What if all of this, the towering skyscrapers, the accolades, the adoration, wasn't enough? What if the part of himself he had buried long ago was the missing piece to the puzzle he couldn't solve? His fingers hovered over the intercom button. "Maggie," he called, his tone commanding yet laced with an unfamiliar edge. His longtime assistant, Maggie, appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, her efficiency as sharp as her tailored suit. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell?" Ethan hesitated for the briefest moment, his gaze lingering on the skyline before finally meeting hers. "I need to add a name to the wedding guest list," he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension. "Send an invitation to Abigail Monroe." Maggie raised an eyebrow, a subtle flicker of curiosity crossing her composed features. "Abigail Monroe?" she asked, her tone cautious. "The journalist?" Ethan nodded, his expression inscrutable. "Yes, and make it one of the limited edition invitations, the ones in the lacquered oak boxes." Maggie tapped her tablet, her professionalism unyielding. "Of course. I'll see that it's done immediately." As the door clicked shut behind her, Ethan sank into his leather chair, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Abigail Monroe. Her name tasted of a past he had deliberately forgotten, a chapter sealed away when ambition had demanded his full attention. She had been his counterpart in another life, before the boardrooms and billion-dollar mergers, back when late-night debates over philosophy and the meaning of success had meant everything. They once shared dreams, until Ethan's hunger for greatness left little room for anything else. Reaching into his desk drawer, he pulled out a photograph, its edges worn from time. In it, a younger Ethan stood beside Abigail, her laughter frozen in a moment of youthful exuberance, his arm draped around her shoulders. They had been partners in every sense until their paths diverged so drastically that they felt like strangers. Sending that invitation wasn't just an act of courtesy or nostalgia. It was a gamble, a question left unanswered for years. Had he made the right choice? And if not, was it too late to find redemption? As the city's lights began to shimmer against the evening sky, Ethan resolved to confront the ghost of his past. What started as a simple invitation would unravel secrets, stir forgotten emotions, and force him to reevaluate the empire he had built. In inviting Abigail Monroe, Ethan wasn't merely rekindling an old connection. He was stepping into the unknown, where everything he thought he understood about success and love might be rewritten. Would she come? And if she did, what truths would she bring with her? The question's weight lingered as night fell over the city, and Ethan Caldwell prepared for a reckoning he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Abigail Monroe sat at the corner of her modest Brooklyn apartment, bathed in the soft, golden light filtering through the old blinds. The space was cluttered but charming, a testament to her life as an investigative journalist. Stacks of books and notepads lined the shelves, and her desk bore the weight of years of relentless deadlines and impossible stories. Her life was far removed from the glittering circles she sometimes reported on, yet she had no regrets. Or so she told herself. Her gaze lingered on the intricately lacquered oak box on her coffee table, its polished surface gleaming under the dim light of her living room lamp. It had arrived that morning, its courier impeccably dressed and far too formal for her neighborhood. The card inside bore Ethan Caldwell's name in bold gold lettering, the handwriting unmistakably his beneath the embossed crest of Caldwell Innovations. It was a wedding invitation, lavish, excessive, and entirely out of place in her world. She hadn't seen Ethan in over a decade, not since the night he chose his empire over her. They had been inseparable once, partners in ambition, though their dreams took different forms. She had wanted to uncover truths and tell stories that mattered, while Ethan had pursued power with unrelenting focus. Their split wasn't sudden. It was the inevitable result of two paths diverging too far to reconnect. But even so, the memory of him lingered like the shadow of a half-finished song. Abigail's fingers traced the elegant edges of the invitation, her mind spinning with questions. Why now? Why her? She had followed Ethan's rise from afar, watching as he transformed from a man with big ideas to a mogul whose decisions could reshape industries. But he had never reached out in all those years, not even once. "Mama, are you okay?" A small voice broke her thoughts. Abigail turned to see Sophie, her 8-year-old daughter, standing in the doorway, clutching a worn teddy bear. Sophie's bright, inquisitive eyes mirrored her father's in ways Abigail had worked hard to ignore. The child was too young to understand the complexities of the past, and Abigail had shielded her from the details of her relationship with Ethan. But now, with that oak box sitting like a silent specter on her coffee table, the past felt suddenly unavoidable. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Abigail said, smiling. "Just thinking." Sophie patted over, her bare feet soft against the hardwood floor. "Who's Ethan Caldwell?" she asked, holding up the invitation she had inspected when her mother wasn't looking. Abigail froze, caught between the instinct to deflect and the need for honesty. "He's someone I used to know," she said finally. "A long time ago." Sophie tilted her head, her curiosity unyielding. "Was he nice?" The question hit harder than Abigail expected. "Sometimes," she said softly, her voice betraying a vulnerability she hadn't meant to show. "But he made choices that weren't easy for either of us." Sophie seemed to consider this, then asked, "Is he my dad?" Abigail's heart stopped. She crouched down, placing her hands gently on Sophie's shoulders. "What makes you ask that, sweetie?" Sophie shrugged, her face innocent. "You look sad when you talk about him." Abigail swallowed hard, brushing a stray curl from Sophie's face. "He's not your dad," she said firmly. "Your dad was someone very special, just like you." Sophie nodded, seemingly satisfied, but Abigail knew the conversation wasn't over. That oak box wasn't just a reminder of what she had lost. It was a doorway to questions she had buried for years. And if she accepted the invitation, it wasn't just herself she'd be exposing to Ethan's world. It was Sophie too. Abigail stood, her resolve hardening. She would go, not to rekindle anything, but to close a chapter that had haunted her for too long. Ethan Caldwell wanted a reckoning? He would get one. Ethan paced his office, his phone buzzing intermittently with updates from his assistant, Maggie. The wedding preparations were in full swing, the guest list finalized, and the press releases carefully crafted to highlight the union of two powerhouses, Ethan Caldwell and Victoria Lang. But the glittering perfection of his life felt like a hollow victory as he thought of the name added to the list only hours earlier, Abigail Monroe. He hadn't told Victoria about Abigail. He hadn't told anyone. For years, he had buried her memory under layers of ambition and success, convincing himself that he had made the right choice. But the cracks in that facade had begun to show, and now, as his wedding approached, the weight of his decisions bore down on him like never before. Maggie entered, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, holding her tablet with her usual efficiency, "the seating arrangements have been finalized, and the caterers will be here for a tasting tomorrow." "Good," Ethan said, his voice clipped. "And Abigail Monroe? Has she responded?" Maggie hesitated. "Not yet, but the invitation was delivered this morning. If she's attending, we'll know soon." Ethan nodded, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. But as the door clicked behind her, he stared at his desk drawer again. Slowly, he reached for it, pulling out the photograph he had retrieved the day before. Abigail's laughter seemed to leap from the image, her joy untainted by the burdens they would later carry. "Why did you walk away?" he whispered, his voice barely audible in the empty room. But the question wasn't directed at Abigail. It was meant for himself. The intercom buzzed. Mr. Caldwell, Maggie said. Victoria is here to see you. Ethan straightened, slipping the photograph back into the drawer. Send her in. Victoria swept into the room, radiant in a tailored dress that accentuated her every feature. She was everything society expected Ethan Caldwell's bride to be, poised, polished, and endlessly ambitious. But as she began discussing floral arrangements and media coverage, Ethan's mind wandered, his focus slipping back to Abigail and the door he had just cracked open. What if Abigail came to the wedding? And what if she didn't? Either way, Ethan knew his life was about to change irrevocably. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was ready. Abigail stared at the open invitation on her kitchen table, the shimmering gold lettering catching the light from the overhead lamp. Beside it sat Sophie, drawing a picture of a castle with colorful crayons, blissfully unaware of the gravity of her mother's internal conflict. Abigail had been wrestling with the decision all day, pacing between her cluttered desk and the small kitchen where her daughter's laughter usually softened the weight of the world. The truth was, she already knew she would go. The journalist in her wanted answers. The woman in her wanted closure. Yet, it wasn't just her heart at stake. It was Sophie's. Ethan Caldwell might not be Sophie's father, but he had shaped the woman Abigail became, for better or worse. And now, Sophie's world could brush against the empire he had built, a thought that frightened and intrigued her. "Mama, what's this?" Sophie asked, pointing to the golden crest on the invitation. "It's an invitation to a fancy event," Abigail replied, keeping her tone light. "Are we going?" Sophie tilted her head, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. Abigail hesitated, then crouched beside her daughter. "Yes, we're going. But it's just for one night. And we must remember it's not about us fitting into their world, okay?" Sophie nodded, though her focus had already shifted back to her drawing. For a moment, Abigail envied her daughter's innocence. The decision made, Abigail spent the next 2 days preparing for the event, borrowing a dress from a friend and polishing a pair of old heels that still carried memories of better times. When the night came, she stood before her mirror, adjusting the hem of the navy gown. The reflection that stared back at her was older, wiser, and more guarded than the girl Ethan had once known. "Mama, you look like a princess," Sophie exclaimed, running into the room with a beaming smile. Abigail laughed softly, pulling Sophie into a hug. "And you, my little one, are the queen." With Sophie dressed in a simple yet elegant dress Abigail had sewn herself, they stepped out into the crisp evening air, hailing a taxi to take them to the grand venue. The invitation listed a luxurious rooftop ballroom in the heart of Manhattan, where Abigail imagined champagne flowed freely and conversations dripped with power and influence. When they arrived, the building loomed above them like a fortress of glass and steel. Sophie's face lit up in awe as they entered, her small hand clutching Abigail's tightly. They stepped into the gilded elevator that carried them to the rooftop, the tension in Abigail's chest tightening with each passing floor. As the doors opened, the scene before them was breathtaking. The rooftop was a masterpiece of opulence, with cascading floral arrangements and shimmering crystal chandeliers reflecting the city lights. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled effortlessly, their laughter blending with the soft strains of a live string quartet. "Wow," Sophie whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. "Remember," Abigail said softly, squeezing her daughter's hand. "We're here to observe, nothing more." But as they stepped further into the room, Abigail felt the weight of a dozen gazes settle on them. She squared her shoulders, meeting each curious glance with quiet confidence. Then, across the room, she saw him. Ethan Caldwell. He stood near the grand staircase, his perfectly tailored suit fitting like a second skin. Time had sharpened his features, but the same intensity lingered in his eyes. Abigail's breath caught as their gazes locked. The bustling crowd seemed to fade momentarily, leaving only the two standing on opposite sides of a chasm built by years of silence and unspoken words. Ethan's expression flickered, surprise, recognition, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. Then his gaze dropped to Sophie, who was tugging on Abigail's hand, oblivious to the tension in the air. Abigail braced herself as he walked toward them, his steps measured but purposeful. "Abigail," he said, his voice quieter than she remembered, but no less commanding. "Ethan," she replied, her tone calm but steady. His eyes shifted to Sophie, and she saw the realization dawn in his expression, his usually unshakable confidence faltering. "And who is this?" "This is Sophie," Abigail said evenly. "My daughter." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he managed a small smile. "It's lovely to meet you, Sophie." Sophie tilted her head, her gaze curious. "Are you the Ethan Caldwell Mama told me about?" Abigail froze, but Ethan crouched slightly, meeting Sophie's eyes with a soft chuckle. "That depends," he said gently. "Did your mama say good things or bad things?" Sophie giggled, and for a moment, the tension broke. But as Abigail watched Ethan interact with her daughter, a storm of emotions churned within her. This night was already proving more complicated than she had anticipated. The soft hum of the string quartet drifted across the rooftop as Ethan led Abigail and Sophie to a quieter corner of the room. The moment's weight pressed heavily on them, though they masked it with polite smiles and casual small talk. "I didn't expect you to come," Ethan admitted once alone, his voice low enough that only Abigail could hear. "I didn't come for you," she replied, her tone firm but not unkind. "I came for myself, to see if the life you chose was worth what you left behind." Ethan flinched at her honesty, but he didn't look away. "And what do you think so far?" Abigail hesitated, glancing at Sophie, who happily explored the intricate floral arrangements nearby. "I think you have everything you ever wanted. But I wonder if you realize what it cost you." He leaned against the railing, the city lights painting his profile in shades of gold and silver. "I've thought about it every day," he confessed. "About you, about us, about the choices I made." "Regret doesn't change the past, Ethan," Abigail said, crossing her arms. "And I'm not here to absolve you." "I don't expect you to," he said quietly. "But seeing you here, with her," his voice trailed off as he glanced at Sophie, "it makes me realize how much I missed and threw away without even knowing it." Abigail's heart ached at his words, but she kept her expression neutral. "You made your choice, Ethan. You don't get to rewrite history just because you don't like how it turned out." "I'm not trying to rewrite anything," he said, facing her fully. "I'm trying to understand if there's any way forward." She shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "Forward? After all this time? You can't expect me to believe that you suddenly care." Ethan's gaze softened, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I've always cared, Abigail. I just didn't know how to show it." Before she could respond, Sophie ran back to them, her face glowing with excitement. "Mama, look. They have chocolate fountains." Abigail forced a smile, brushing a stray curl from Sophie's face. "That sounds amazing, sweetheart. Go ahead and take a look." As Sophie bounded off, Ethan stepped closer, his voice urgent but sincere. "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be part of the future. For Sophie and you." Abigail stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "You don't even know her, Ethan. You don't know what she likes, what makes her laugh, or what she dreams about. You can't just walk in and expect to be her father." "I know," he said, his tone steady, "but I'd like the chance to try." Abigail turned away, her eyes scanning the glittering cityscape. "You don't get second chances, Ethan. Not easily. Not without proving you've earned it." "Then let me prove it," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. For a moment, she said nothing, her mind racing with memories of the life they once shared and the life she had built without him. Finally, she turned back to him, her gaze piercing. "We'll see," she said, her voice soft but resolute. And with that, the reckoning truly began. The rooftop's opulence and the murmur of elegant conversation seemed distant as Ethan watched Sophie marvel at the chocolate fountains and the glittering chandeliers. Abigail stood nearby, her arms crossed, radiating a protective energy that reminded him of the woman he once knew, a woman who had always fought for what mattered most. But tonight, that fierce resolve was directed at him, and Ethan knew he had a long road ahead. He approached Abigail cautiously, his voice low to avoid drawing attention. "Thank you for coming," he said, his tone sincere. "I know it wasn't an easy decision." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. You're right, it wasn't. But I needed to see if this was worth the risk, for her. Ethan's eyes softened as he glanced at Sophie, chatting animatedly with a server about the desserts. She's incredible, he said quietly. You've done an amazing job raising her. Abigail's shoulders tensed, but she didn't look away. I had no choice, she said. I've been everything to her. Mother, father, protector. And I'll keep doing that, whether you're in the picture. Ethan nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy cloak. I don't doubt that. But I'd like to be in the picture if you let me. Abigail hesitated, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of insincerity. You say that now, Ethan, but being a father isn't about showing up once and making a big speech. It's about consistency. It's about staying, even when it's hard. I know, he replied, his voice steady. And I'm ready to prove that to both of you. Before Abigail could respond, Sophie ran to them, her face glowing excitedly. Mama, they have marshmallows. Can I have some? Abigail forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from Sophie's face. Of course, sweetheart. Just one, though. We don't want a sugar overload. Sophie nodded eagerly and then turned to Ethan. Do you like marshmallows? Ethan crouched down, meeting her eye level. I do, he said with a smile, especially when they're roasted over a campfire. Do you like camping? Sophie's eyes widened. I've never been camping. Is it fun? It's the best, Ethan said, his voice warm. Maybe one day we can all go together. Sophie glanced up at Abigail, her excitement barely contained. Can we, Mama? Abigail hesitated, caught off guard by the casual way Ethan had included himself in their world. She looked at Sophie, her daughter's joy tugging at her heart, then at Ethan, whose expression held a flicker of hope. We'll see, she said finally, her tone guarded. As the evening wore on, Ethan gravitated toward Sophie's infectious energy. Her curiosity was boundless, her questions rapid-fire and full of wonder. She reminded him so much of Abigail in their younger days, unapologetically bright, unafraid to ask the hard questions. At one point, Sophie dragged Ethan to a table where she had spotted a small display of mechanical gadgets, part of the evening's entertainment. Look, it's like a robot, she exclaimed, pointing to a wind-up automaton that clinked and whirred as it moved. Ethan knelt beside her, examining the device with genuine interest. It's pretty neat, he said. Do you like robots? Sophie nodded vigorously. I want to build one someday. Mama says I can do anything if I try hard enough. Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with pride. Your mama's right. And when you're ready, I'd love to help you build one. Really? Sophie asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Really? He said, extending his pinky. Pinky promise. Sophie grinned and linked her small finger with his. Okay, but you have to keep your promise. I will, Ethan said, his tone solemn. I promise. Abigail watched the exchange from across the room with mixed emotions she couldn't quite name. She saw how Sophie lit up around Ethan and how easily he had stepped into her world. It was a side of him she hadn't seen in years, kind, attentive, and genuine. But the fear lingered. Could he sustain this, or was it just a fleeting attempt to ease his guilt? Later, as the evening began to wind down, Ethan approached Abigail once more. Sophie had fallen asleep in a chair nearby, her head resting on Abigail's shawl. Thank you, he said quietly, his gaze earnest, for letting me spend time with her. Abigail sighed, brushing a hand over Sophie's curls. She likes you, she admitted, her voice tinged with hope and caution. But liking you isn't enough. You need to show up, Ethan, consistently, not just for her, but for me. I know, he said, and I will. Abigail met his gaze, searching for any sign of weakness or pretense. For the first time, she saw something that felt like truth. If you mean that, she said softly, then start by taking things slow. She's 8 years old, Ethan. Her world is fragile. I understand, he said, his voice steady. One step at a time. Abigail nodded, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. One step at a time. As Ethan prepared to leave, he glanced back at Sophie, her peaceful face illuminated by the soft glow of the chandeliers. Unlike anything he had known in his years of chasing success, he felt a surge of determination. For the first time, his purpose was clear, not just to build an empire but to rebuild a family. And this time, he wouldn't let it slip through his fingers. 2 weeks passed before Ethan found the courage to reach out again. He had spent the time reflecting, diving into his commitments at work, and carefully preparing for his next steps. He knew this wasn't about grand gestures but consistency, building trust, one moment at a time. When he called Abigail, she was hesitant but agreed to meet him at a small cafe near Sophie's school. It was a neutral place, quiet and unassuming, perfect for a conversation that could tip the balance of their tentative truce. Ethan arrived early, the usual confidence in his step tempered by a nervous energy he couldn't shake. The cafe's warm ambience, with its worn wooden tables and the scent of fresh-baked pastries, felt worlds away from the sterile, high-stakes boardrooms he was accustomed to. When Abigail walked in, she looked as poised as ever, her coat pulled tightly around her as if bracing for a storm. Sophie skipped beside her, clutching a notebook filled with doodles and ideas for her robot. "Thank you for meeting me," Ethan said as they sat down, his tone sincere. Abigail nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "You said you wanted to talk about Sophie." "I do," Ethan replied, glancing at the girl, who was now engrossed in sketching at the table. "But I also wanted to talk about us, about how we move forward." Abigail raised an eyebrow, her skepticism palpable. "Ethan, I agreed to this meeting because Sophie wanted to see you again, not to rehash old wounds." "I understand," he said, leaning forward slightly, "but I can't change that we're tied together. Through her, if nothing else. I want to make this work, Abigail. I want to be a part of her life and yours." Abigail's gaze softened, but only slightly. "It's not that simple. You can't just show up and expect everything to fall into place." "I know," Ethan admitted, "but I will do whatever it takes to earn your trust, to prove to you and Sophie that I'm here for the long haul." Before Abigail could respond, Sophie looked up from her notebook, holding up her latest drawing. "Look, Mr. Caldwell. It's a robot that can clean your room and make pancakes." Ethan smiled, taking the notebook from her and examining the detailed sketch. "This is incredible," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You're talented, Sophie." The girl beamed, her enthusiasm contagious. "Mama says I should keep drawing and dreaming. Do you think I could build this for real one day?" "I know you can," Ethan said firmly, handing the notebook back to her. "And I'd love to help if you'll let me." Abigail watched the exchange, her heart a tangle of emotions. She wanted to protect Sophie, to shield her from disappointment. But seeing how her daughter lit up around Ethan made her wonder if it was worth giving him a chance. "Ethan," Abigail said, her voice steady but cautious. "If you're serious about this, you need to understand something. Sophie comes first. Always. I wouldn't have it any other way," Ethan replied, meeting her gaze. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan worked tirelessly to earn Abigail and Sophie's trust. He started small, occasionally picking Sophie up from school, helping her with her robot designs, and taking her to the park on weekends. His presence in their lives was still tentative, but it was steady, a far cry from the man Abigail had once known. Abigail, ever the skeptic, watched him closely. She saw the effort he put into understanding Sophie's world and how he listened to her stories and encouraged her ideas. He didn't just show up, he stayed, even when things weren't easy. On Saturday, Ethan arrived at their modest townhouse with a surprise, a beginner robotics kit for Sophie. Her face lit up as she tore open the box, examining the pieces with a meticulous focus that reminded Ethan of himself. "This is amazing," Sophie exclaimed, already laying out the parts on the coffee table. "Can we start building it now?" "Of course," Ethan said, crouching beside her. "But you're the boss. You tell me what to do." As they worked together, Abigail watched from the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She couldn't deny the changes she saw in Ethan. The way he laughed with Sophie and his patience when she struggled with a tricky piece. It was a side of him she hadn't expected to see, and it stirred something she had long buried. Later that evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Ethan lingered in the living room, his gaze fixed on the partially built robot on the coffee table. Abigail joined him, sitting down on the opposite end of the couch. "You've come a long way," she said quietly, breaking the silence. Ethan looked up, his expression earnest. "I had to. I couldn't keep living the way I was, chasing things that didn't matter." Abigail studied him for a moment, her walls beginning to crack. "It's not easy for me to trust you, Ethan. You've hurt me before, and I can't let that happen again. Not to Sophie." "I know," he said, his voice steady, "and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I'm here, Abigail. For her. For you. And I'm not going anywhere." Abigail's gaze softened, her heart wrestling with her mind. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this could work. "Let's take it one step at a time," she said. Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. One step at a time. Together, they sat in the quiet living room, the promise of a new beginning lingering. Abigail's cautious optimism grew as Ethan continued to show up for Sophie in ways she never expected. He didn't just make promises, he followed through. Every weekend, he brought new ideas to Sophie's robotics projects, and during the weekdays, he made an effort to check in, often calling to ask how her day went. One afternoon, as Abigail was organizing papers in her small home office, she overheard Sophie chatting with Ethan in the living room. The sound of their laughter floated through the house, warm and unguarded. Sophie explained her latest idea, a robot to plant flowers and water gardens. "It could make the world more beautiful," Sophie said earnestly. Ethan chuckled. "I think you're already doing that, kiddo." Abigail leaned against the doorframe, her heart pulling in two directions. She wanted to trust this new version of Ethan, to believe he had changed. But she also knew how fragile Sophie's world was and how much damage a broken promise could do. Her internal conflict deepened when Ethan proposed something bold during dinner one evening. "I was thinking," he began, his tone careful, "we should take Sophie camping. She's been talking about it non-stop since the night at the cafe." Abigail's fork paused midair. "Camping? Just a weekend trip," Ethan clarified. "I thought it could be a good way for us to spend time together, away from everything else. A chance to bond." Sophie's eyes lit up. "Can we, Mama? Please." Abigail hesitated, her instincts urging caution. But when she looked at Sophie's hopeful face and saw Ethan's quiet determination, she found herself nodding. "Okay, but just one weekend," Sophie cheered, throwing her arms around Abigail. "Thank you, Mama." Ethan smiled. Relief was evident in his expression. "I'll take care of everything. Just tell me what we need." The camping trip was planned meticulously. Ethan showed up early Saturday morning with a car packed full of gear, including a tent, sleeping bags, and enough supplies to last a week. Abigail couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at his over-preparedness, but Sophie was thrilled. The drive to the campsite was filled with Sophie's excited chatter, and by the time they arrived, the late afternoon sun was casting golden light over the sprawling fields and dense woods. Ethan parked near a clearing, and they began unpacking. "This spot is perfect," Ethan said, surveying the area. "Plenty of space and a great view of the stars tonight." Sophie immediately started exploring, running toward a nearby stream. "Look, Mama, there are little fish." Abigail smiled, her usual tension easing in the peaceful surroundings. Setting up camp, however, proved to be a test of patience. Ethan struggled with the tent poles, and Sophie's attempts to help only added to the chaos. Abigail couldn't help but laugh as the tent collapsed for the third time. "I thought you said you've handled billion-dollar mergers," she teased. Ethan grinned, his frustration melting away at the sound of her laughter. "Mergers don't involve unpredictable tent poles or a very eager assistant," he joked, nodding toward Sophie. By the time the tent was finally standing, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. They gathered around a small campfire Ethan had built, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. "Did you ever go camping when you were little, Mama?" Sophie asked, her marshmallow turning golden over the flames. Abigail shook her head. "Not really. I grew up in the city, but I always loved the idea of it. Sitting by a fire, staring at the stars." Ethan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. It's never too late to start, he said quietly. Abigail met his gaze, the warmth of the fire reflected in her eyes. Maybe not, she admitted. As the evening stretched on, the first meteor streaked across the sky. Sophie gasped, pointing upward. Look, a shooting star. They all tilted their heads back, watching the celestial display unfold. Sophie's face was filled with awe, her small hand gripping Abigail's tightly. Do you think astronauts get to see this? Sophie asked, her voice soft and wondering. They do, Ethan replied. But you know what's even cooler? Knowing that we're all made of stardust. Every single one of us. Sophie's eyes widened. Even me? Especially you, Ethan said with a smile. You're one of the brightest stars I know. Abigail's heart tightened at his words, her defenses crumbling further. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where Ethan was part of their lives, not as the man who had once left, but as the man he was becoming. Later, as Sophie drifted off to sleep in the tent, Abigail and Ethan stayed outside by the fire, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. You're good with her, Abigail said, breaking the quiet. She makes it easy, Ethan replied. She's an amazing kid. Abigail looked at him, her voice softer now. She is, and she deserves someone who will always be there for her. Ethan met her gaze, his expression earnest. I intend to be. Abigail nodded, her heart torn between hope and fear. We'll see. Ethan didn't press her for more. Instead, they sat together under the stars, the quiet hum of the forest around them, and for the first time in years, Abigail felt the faintest flicker of trust. The camping trip left an imprint on Abigail she couldn't ignore. Ethan's dedication to Sophie was genuine, and for the first time, Abigail saw him not just as the man who had once walked away, but as someone willing to fight for a place in their lives. However, trust wasn't built overnight, and Abigail was careful not to let her guard down too quickly. Ethan, for his part, was relentless in proving he was here to stay. He didn't just make promises, he acted on them. Every week, he showed up for Sophie's school projects, helped her brainstorm ideas for her robot, and even attended her first science fair. When Sophie won first place for her invention, a small, solar-powered gardening robot, Ethan was there cheering the loudest, his pride undeniable. You were amazing, Sophie, Ethan said, crouching to her level. You're going to change the world someday. Sophie beamed, clutching her trophy tightly. Only because you helped me, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Ethan's chest tightened at her words. No, he said, his tone steady. You did this, Sophie. All I did was stand by your side. Abigail watched the exchange from a distance, her emotions a whirlwind. She couldn't deny the bond forming between Ethan and Sophie, but it also left her feeling vulnerable. Could she truly let him back into their lives, or was she risking everything she had worked so hard to protect? One evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Ethan stayed behind to talk. They sat on the couch, a quiet tension lingering between them. I know I've been pushing, Ethan said, his voice low. And I know it's not easy for you to trust me. But I need you to know something. I'm not doing this out of guilt or obligation. I'm doing this because I want to be here. For her. For you. Abigail looked down at her hands, her walls beginning to crack. I want to believe you, Ethan. I do. But I can't risk her getting hurt again. And if I'm honest, she hesitated, her voice faltering. I don't know if I can handle it either. Ethan reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. You don't have to do this alone anymore, he said. Let me prove it to you. One step at a time. Abigail met his gaze, her heart wavering between fear and hope. After a long moment, she nodded. One step at a time. Months passed, and Ethan slowly became an integral part of their lives. He didn't just show up for the big moments. He was there for the small ones, too. The late-night homework sessions, the family dinners, the quiet afternoons spent building robots with Sophie. Each moment chipped away at the walls Abigail had built around her heart. One day, Ethan arrived at Abigail's townhouse with an unexpected announcement. I have something to show you both, he said, a hint of nervous excitement in his voice. What is it? Sophie asked, her curiosity piqued. You'll see, Ethan said with a smile. But you'll need to come with me. Abigail hesitated, her protective instincts flaring. Ethan, what is this about? Trust me, he said softly, his gaze steady. Reluctantly, Abigail agreed, and they all piled into Ethan's car. The drive was quiet, but filled with anticipation. When they finally arrived, Abigail's breath caught in her throat. They stood before a charming two-story house with a white picket fence and a spacious yard. It was nothing like the sleek penthouses or sprawling estates Ethan had once pursued. This house was warm and inviting, designed for a family. What is this? Abigail asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan turned to her, his expression earnest. It's ours. Suppose you want it to be. I wanted to give Sophie a home where she could grow and dream. A place where we could build a life together. Sophie's eyes widened as she darted toward the front yard. Mama, look. There's a garden. And a big tree I can climb. Abigail stood frozen, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Ethan, this is too much. It's not just a house, Abigail, he said, stepping closer. It's a promise. I'm here for the long haul, for Sophie and you. Abigail looked at him, her heart torn between fear and the undeniable pull of hope. She wanted to believe him, to trust that this time would be different. Sophie ran back to them, her face glowing with excitement. Can we live here, Mama? Please. Abigail knelt, brushing a hand over Sophie's curls. It's not just my decision, sweetheart. This is our home. And if it makes you happy. Sophie threw her arms around Abigail, her joy infectious. Thank you, Mama. Ethan watched the scene unfold, his heart swelling with relief and gratitude. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged, not just in Sophie's life, but in Abigail's as well. As they walked through the front door together, Abigail glanced at Ethan, her gaze filled with cautious hope. One step at a time, she said softly. Ethan smiled, nodding. One step at a time. At that moment, surrounded by the promise of a new beginning, they knew they had found something worth fighting for. A family built not on perfection but on love, forgiveness, and the determination to move forward together.